Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to wait for a moment while people filter into our room. If you've done this before with me, you may be familiar with my analogy, but I like it so much I'm going to say it again. It's a little like when you're standing outside a lecture hall and they've suddenly opened the doors to let people in, and people can only filter in one at a time. So it takes a little bit to get everyone in the Zoom room. So we're just going to wait for a minute to make sure we gather as many people as possible. Thank you for your patience. Okay, while we wait for just a little bit, I will call your attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So you may have to wiggle your mouse, but you'll see an icon at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. So if at any point during this presentation you have a question for our presenter, you can just click on that icon and you can type in your question, enter your question, and that question will come to me and to my co-host, and we'll make sure that we answer as many questions as we can at the end of the event or during the event. So, excellent. So I think I'll begin. Let me officially introduce myself. My name is Kelly Greenlee. I am the Community Outreach Librarian at Prince Memorial Library. Very happy to see so many people here. It's wonderful to have such a good turnout of history and archaeology enthusiasts. So tonight's presentation is the first of two on the topic of archaeology of Casco Bay. So if you enjoy this one, and we hope you do, and I'm quite certain that you will, you can join us for the second installment, which is scheduled for April 7th at 6:30 p.m. April 7th is a Thursday, if you're wondering. Let me begin. I would like to begin just by taking a moment to offer gratitude to the Wabanaki people who for hundreds of years have inhabited and cared for this land upon which we work and live and play. Speaking of land, I consider myself very lucky to live in an area that's surrounded by land and water that is preserved and protected by my local land trust. Today, my co-host for the evening is Chris Cabot. He is the Executive Director of the Chebeague and Cumberland Land Trust, or CCLT, as it is commonly called. I should note here also that CCLT is a co-sponsor of tonight's event. So that being said, I will introduce my co-host, Chris Cabot.
Thank you, Kelly. This is exciting to partner again with the Prince Memorial Library on tonight's webinar. The library is a great resource in our community, and I really want to thank Kelly and Thomas for organizing this event and co-sponsoring it with CCLT. I'll just give a little bit of an intro about CCLT, and then I'll introduce Thomas, our main event speaker. CCLT is a small two-town land trust, so we cover the town of Cumberland and the town of Chebeague Island. We work to protect land and steward those lands that we've permanently protected. And we also provide environmental education programs like this webinar tonight. So I see a lot of CCLT members on the list here, and I'm so glad you've joined us, and I'm so thankful for your membership. If you're interested in helping to protect the natural world, either by supporting our work financially or by volunteering, getting your hands dirty with us on the trails, please be in touch. We're always looking for more support. So now I will introduce Thomas. Thomas Bennett first excavated a shell midden on Mosher Island in Freeport in 1986. He's worked on archaeological digs in Arizona, Maine, and Massachusetts, and there he was the a field supervisor on the Spectacle Island Shell Midden Dig, which was a component of the Big Dig. He's authored 2 articles in the Maine Archaeological Bulletin and compiled multiple volumes of Cumberland and North Yarmouth vital records. He has an MA in American and New England Studies from the University of Southern Maine. So thank you so much, Thomas, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say tonight.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Chris. This is actually the second time that I've done an archaeological project with CCLT. In 2016, Art Spiess of the Maine Historic Preservation Commission and I co-directed a 1-week dig down at Broad Cove Reserve, which I'll get into more during the second session in April. But that was an opportunity for us, the town and the state, to work on a CCLT steward piece of land. And we found some tremendous stuff down there. And we hope to do more work of that sort, more field work. What I hope to do tonight is introduce shell midden archaeology to the audience. And what that entails is talking first about the post-glacial sequence in Casco Bay, and then I'll discuss the cultural sequence of Maine natives, or the natives that live in what is now Maine. And then I'll talk about shell midden archaeology in particular, and then I have a little slide, a few slides at the end to show you some island archaeology in action. There's going to be a lot of information that we're covering, so please, if you have questions, I will stop at the end of each section after the geology piece of it. I'll stop if somebody has a particular question, after the cultural piece, and then after the shell midden piece. So having said that, I will now share my screen. So this is a great picture. This is not how we do archaeology in Maine, but apparently in Denmark in the 1800s, the late 1800s, the archaeologists would sit at the top of the trench there and let the workers do the work. But okay, before I get started, I really need to thank the archaeologists and geologists who've done the base, most of the work that I'm going to be presenting tonight. As Chris said, I have an MA in American and New England Studies. That was an interdisciplinary program. And that means that I'm not just a historian, but I brought in geology, archaeology, statistics, other fields into what I do as a historian. And that was really the model that began when shell midden archaeology really got started in the mid 1800s. So I really want to thank Edward Sylvester Morse, Jeffrey Wyman, Dean Snow, Bruce Bork, Alice Kelly, who have done work in the field in Maine and really built up the body of knowledge that I'm going to be presenting tonight. But in particular, I want to thank Art Spiess. I borrowed very liberally from a couple of his articles for this presentation. And Nathan Hamilton, who got me interested in archaeology back in the mid 80s when I was at USM as an undergraduate, who helped me on the Broad Cove Reserve dig part of it, and who will be helping me do some work on Chebeague and in Cumberland this summer. Hopefully we're going to be doing some field work. So in 1879, Edward Sylvester Morse did a monograph on the shell middens of Omori, Japan, where he was in Japan. He discovered a shell midden. He's recognized as the father of Japanese archaeology. And in the introduction to that book, he wrote, along the eastern coast of the United States, the ocean has been encroaching upon the land, and shell mounds in Casco Bay, Maine, are in process of being washed away by the waves. 140 years later, unfortunately, that's still true. The erosion of not just the shell middens, but the land in Casco Bay has increased rapidly just within the past month. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that sea levels have risen 1 foot over the last 100 years, and they're projected to rise another 1 foot by 2050. So that pace of sea level rise and erosion, coupled with stronger and bigger storms, really does not spell good news for not just the shell middens of Casco Bay, but the islands of Casco Bay, the homes of Casco Bay, etc. So what is the shell? The shell mounds that Morse is talking about are generally referred to as middens now, after the Danish Kyrkenmiddens. This is a picture of the Broad Cove Reserve dig, a small midden, but as we'll find in my April talk, that it's got a lot of information that it can tell us about what the people were doing there, what the past cultural life waves of the visited and inhabited Casco Bay in the pre-European times were doing, particularly relative to their diet. So shell middens on the coast and on the shore is significant in that it helps
Thomas, you are glitching.
preserve any other material, any other perishable material, and any other perishable items like that. Basketry has been known to be recovered. I have never seen basketry recovered, but it's something that can be preserved because of the nature of the shells. And I'm going to get more into shell middens in particular, but before we do that, I'm having trouble moving this slide, Kelly. There it goes. Before we do that, we have to really talk about what the region looked like 30,000 years ago. This slide here shows you the maximum extent of the Laurentide glacial sheet. This is about 28,000 to 24,000 years ago. You can see that the whole of the area was covered by a 2-mile thick, in places, glacial sheet. And this is important because the glacial sheet, once this melted, it created large fluctuations in the sea level in the Gulf of Maine. And those fluctuations, the changes in the shoreline have really guided the coastal settlement patterns. And that's what we're talking about here, is we're talking about where people settled on the coast. So the sea level along the Maine coast has been affected by changes in the global ocean levels due to the melting of the glacial sheets, the rebound of the land mass after removing the weight of the glacier, and the later submergence of the land. And we're still seeing that submergence today. Part of the sea level rise is due to a continuing submergence of the land mass. And all of these changes affected the land because the sea level rise, the moderate climate change, eventual colder temperatures, and a higher tidal amplitude all affected changes in the onshore forest and the marine ecology. So as we look at this, this picture of the maximum extent of the glacial ice, you should keep in mind 2 things: the amount of water that would have been in that ice and the weight of that ice on the land. So roughly 13,000 years before present marks the end of the Ice Age, with some variance from south to north. The ice retreated, and the sea, bolstered by the ice melt, flooded the newly exposed land. And the sea at that point, around 13,000 years ago, actually around 16,000 years ago, reached as far inland as Augusta, Bingham, and Millinocket. So if we're talking about past shorelines in Maine, we have to think about this as a past shoreline. So if we're looking for shell middens, if there were any of that at that time, and we don't believe there were, we have to look in a different spot. And we know this because of something called the Presumpscot Formation. When the glaciers melted and all of this ice, all of this water rushed onto the lowlands, the Maine lowlands, and pushed that shoreline 100 kilometers or 62 miles inland, it left behind this very dramatic, as you can see as I'm using my cursor here, you have this blue mud, the Presumpscot Formation, excuse me. And that marks the furthest, where that Presumpscot Formation mud is in Maine, marks the furthest inland advance of the ocean after the glaciers melted. So as the glaciers were advancing over the 1,000 years before they melted, they scoured the earth. They really broke it up and they left little in its wake. And the subsequent retreat of that ice left a covering of what we call glacial till, basically crushed rock and fine silt. And so when we're digging in Maine, we know that if we find either Presumpscot Formation clay, this blue marine clay, or the glacial till, that we know that there's no human habitation under that. So when we encounter that in a dig, we know we can stop digging because we're not going to find any cultural remains after that. So this graph here, this is courtesy of Alice Kelly and Joe Kelly up at UMO. They don't know I'm using it, but I want to mention that anyway. So here we have up this yellow block up here in the upper left is the high stand of the shoreline. So about 16,000 years ago, the sea level was about 60 meters above where it is now. So about 200 feet, let's say. That was due to the melting of the glacier, as I said, and the rush of the melted water coming in onto the land. And you can see it drops down because once that happened, once the glacier melted, it released that, who knows how many tons of ice that were sitting on top of the landmass, allowing the landmass to jump up. If you put two books on top of a waterbed, it's going to depress the waterbed. When you take them off, the water is going to rise up again. That's what the land did. And over the period from about 16,000 years before present to 12,000 years before present, the land rebounded and it pushed the shoreline out to what is about 200 feet or 60 meters below what it currently is. So there was this big fluctuation in where the shoreline set up from 100 kilometers inland on the lowland of Maine to a spot where most of Casco Bay would have been dry land, except for the rivers running through it. So if we think of Chebeague, that would have been part of the mainland. We think of most of, I mean, probably all of the islands in Casco Bay would have been part of the mainland with rivers coming through it. But then at that point, around 12,000 years ago, the land started submerging, and it's been doing that ever since. So it rebounded, it jumped up, and then it started settling down again. And that's when we see sea level rising again. You can see that there are these little bumps, but it's pretty much a gradual from about 60 meters below sea level where it is now to where we are now, where the current sea level is. And one of the things that happened about 3,500 years ago there were low tides in the Gulf of Maine until about 4,000, 3,500 years ago. And that created a situation where there was a warm climate. The water was much warmer than it is today. It didn't have the tides, the tidal amplitude of maybe a foot, maybe 2 feet. But something happened around 3,500 years ago that caused a much higher tidal amplitude. And the higher tidal range continued to where it currently is now at about 8 to 13 feet. And what that did, the higher tidal range, it introduced cooler water into the Gulf of Maine, which replaced the warm summer waters that 4,000 years ago would have supported warm water marine animals, inshore swordfish, so a much different ecology than we have now. And we see this in the shell middens that we dig. We can see that there's a distinct change in the animals that were being eaten and preserved in the shell midden from 3,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago. So there's a distinct change. A change from the swordfish and other warm water marine animals to a cold water inshore ecology that includes lobster, clams, seals, birds, and various fish species that are cold water loving. And those climatic changes and the effect on that fishery impacted the native people who were dependent on that fishery for their dietary needs. And as I said, part of this sequence is known due to shell midden archaeology. Are there any questions about that very brief overview of the post-glacial sequence that I can answer? You can hold them to the end. I'm happy to do that if you prefer. So now I'd like to talk about the native people who were in what we now know as Maine, and the different cultures that they supported, that they lived under. So the Paleo-Indian period, generally considered to be 13,000 to 11,000 years ago. 13,000 years ago is when people first moved into northern New England, the Canadian Maritimes, and the first people who populated, we know them as the Paleo-Indian people. Maine's climate at that time was subarctic, which means that from north to south, we had a grassy tundra, open spruce forest, and dense spruce-dominated conifer forest. And the Paleo-Indians, very distinctive tool set, and I'll show you those later, that indicates big game hunting. And there's very little evidence for a coastal marine economy during the Paleo-Indian period. And probably most of that is due to the changing of the coastline over the years, that we haven't found the evidence for anything of that sort. So the Paleo-Indian period people were replaced by what we call the Archaic period. And that's differentiated by a number of different sub-periods, as you can see here: early, middle, late, the Laurentian tradition, small stem point, late Archaic. But what we know from them, getting back to the geology, the regional climate had warmed up, less tundra-like. There was more hardwood trees moving north as the climate warmed. So a change in the ecology and a change in the peopling of the area. And the Archaic people, we know that there were small seasonal villages concentrated along lakes, the main river valleys, and in coastal sites. We find heavy woodworking stone tools, ground stoned, gouges, and chisels. that we surmise were used to create dugout canoes, which are very heavy. They wouldn't have been conducive to taking on, to a small creek or a lot of the other smaller waterways in Maine. But so they seem to be more large river vehicles. And we also find hooks, harpoons, and stone net sinkers that indicate that they were hunting swordfish and longline fishing for cod. So not only a change in the environment, but a change in the technology that the people were using to adapt to that environment. And as you can imagine, because of the changing coastline, most of the coastal archaeological deposits from 4,500 to 4,000 years ago have been severely impacted by rising sea levels. Now, we have had trawlers in the Gulf of Maine who have trawled up stone tools from the Archaic period. So that's a good indication that if we're looking for coastal sites, we want to be 200 feet underwater out in the bay, out in Gulf of Maine, in Casco Bay. So some people may have heard of the red paint people. Those are really the small stem point tradition and the late Archaic moorhead phase people. The red paint comes from the red ochre that they used in their graves. And it was called red paint people for a long time, but now we tend to think of it as the moorhead phase burial tradition. So when we get down to the last of the Archaic people, the late Archaic, 3,800 to 3,000 years ago, we know that this is when Casco Bay is changing over from that warm water, low tidal amplitude environment to much colder and a higher tidal amplitude. So creates more tidal mixing, and it alters the animal ecology to pretty much what we see today. And around the same time, the Susquehanna tradition people, named after the Susquehanna River Valley in the mid-Atlantic, moved into Maine from the south, bringing new religious beliefs, new stone tool technology. And we know that they were harvesting shellfish and using fish weirs to collect various fish, various inshore fish types such as sculpin, flounder, sturgeon, salmon. These are practices that we find in the ceramic period, the most recent period that you see down there at the bottom, broken up into 3 different phases: early, middle, and late. But there are basically 6 phases, and that's based on the ceramics that they used. Now, there were a number of changes in the cultures, the cultural body that the native people use to exist in the environment. When we say culture, we're talking about a number of things. Now we think of going to the ballet or a concert. When we think of culture, we think of how did these people adapt to their environment? And there are a number of things we see. One of them, ceramic period, we know that they were using wood-fired ceramic. We hadn't seen that before. So pottery, basically. We also see the introduction of the birch bark canoe, much lighter than a dugout canoe, allows more mobility. You can take it places that you wouldn't want to take a dugout canoe. So there's a change in the travel patterns that these people are exhibiting and using to target the resources they needed. And then we also see the bow and arrow for hunting. And then corn, bean, and squash horticulture, the 3 sisters, as we call them, that was a further adaptation to the environment in which they're living. So we no longer see the axes and stone gouges of the Archaic period, and we find campsites located on smaller drainages, easily accessible by a lighter canoe, but not with the dugout canoe. What were they doing? They were their subsistence strategy. So how they got their food is generally marked by hunting, fishing, and gathering economy that incorporated cooking in ceramic pots and the increased mobility of their birch bark canoes. They were using these subsistence and settlement strategies to travel seasonally to available resources. So we think they were coming out to the coast to target marine resources during the late winter, early spring, and probably hunting in the inland other seasons. So a much more mobile, we don't want to think of what they were doing on the coast as a permanent habitation at this point, early ceramic period, middle ceramic period. We don't see agriculture in this part of Maine. We do basically south of Casco Bay later, but we think of what they were doing as a much more seasonal strategy to target seasonally available resources. And then the last period is the contact period, starting about 1500 AD, not much longer after Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean. We know there were Europeans in the Gulf of St. Lawrence targeting, the codfish fishery, coming here seasonally as well, drying out codfish and taking them back to Portugal and Britain. But what they did, they brought new technology and they brought disease. Copper, iron, and glass objects replaced items that the natives had relied on for thousands of years. And warfare and disease resulted in drastic population loss, tribal reorganization, and drastic cultural change. Excuse me.
Thomas, before you move on to, there has been one question that came up around the geology. So stepping back slightly, you were showing on your graph the changes in sea level. The question is around, are you saying that the coastline has been subsiding since 12,000 years ago? I thought we were still rebounding. So and I thought I had heard the same thing, is where are we at with isostatic rebound, and are we subsiding or rebounding now?
It's subsiding. That's why we're seeing this. That's part of the reason we're seeing the rising sea level today and over the past, the 200 years that we know that we have written accounts of it. What Noah has said, that the after the melting of the glacier, the sea level pushed in, but then once all that weight was off, the land rebounded, and that rebound lasted until about 12,000 years ago. And since then, the land has been submerging at various rates, and it's still subsiding now. So it's sinking because that's what it's doing. So it's kind of a up, down, up thing. Of when we looked at that graph, it's the shoreline gone in 100 kilometers, then it goes out, and now it's come back in, and it's continuing to come back in as we see, erosion that we're seeing is because the sea is coming in and taking away the land that is there.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
I think it does. And then there's one more quick one. And you mentioned the underwater dredging at a certain meter level. The question from a attendee is there such a thing as underwater archaeology?
There is, yeah. So it's actually the trawlers, the fishing trawlers that are out. And we know that, at 12,000 years ago, after the land had stopped, while it was still in that rebound phase, that would have pushed the shoreline out to about, the shoreline would have been, the sea level would have been at about 200 feet below what it is now. Okay, so that means that all of that land, the coast would have been, I had a map, I didn't really draw it correctly on it, but the shoreline would have been out, you know, a number of miles out, 20 or 30 miles out, maybe as much as 60 miles out. And we know now that that is what is now the 200-foot depth contour out in Casco Bay. And I'm not sure what fishing they're doing, but as they're trawling, they're pulling along the bottom, and they're finding tools out there. And underwater archaeology would be great. I think that'd be a little deep for underwater archaeology, but I don't really know. I'm not a underwater archaeologist.
Thanks.
Does that answer?
That does, and those are the answers, questions we have now. So sorry to interrupt.
Oh, not at all. Okay, so this is a nice graphic from the Maine Archaeological Society, which presents a linear from left to right timeline of the cultural sequence of native artifacts. From left to right, we have the flakestone tools of the Paleo-Indian period. And these are not all to scale and not in scale relative to each other, but still you can see that we have some really beautiful pieces here, and I wish we were in person. I'm hoping we can be in person for the April session, because I can bring some examples of these in. But so we have the Paleo-Indian period on the left, the flakestone and groundstone. You can see the flakestone up top here, the Archaic period flakestone. And then the groundstone, you can see one of these gouges down here. These are groundstone, a groundstone pendant here with the hole in it. And those would be woodworking tools. And then over here, looks like a hammerhead or something. That would be groundstone as well. And these two that with the little lips on them, these are groundstone net sinkers. So for fishing. And then all the way to the right there, we have the ceramic period. Not many groundstone tool technologies, but we start to see bone. You do have a groundstone axe head down at the bottom, piece of ceramic, but a lot of nice stone tools up top of varying types that let us know a general date on a site. These are known as diagnostic artifacts. And a diagnostic artifact is an item that is indicative of a particular time and or cultural group. And when we find a diagnostic artifact, such as one of these beautiful Paleo-Indian pieces over here, we can say, oh, that's Paleo-Indian. We know that's probably 13,000 to 11,000 years before present. So this is what a diagnostic artifact is. Now, if we take that, that graphic and turn it 90 degrees to the left and line those up, so the Paleo-Indian pieces are on the bottom, and we go up through, you know, the early Archaic, the middle Archaic, the late Archaic, and then get into the ceramic period, it allows us to discuss two concepts that are central to archaeology. The first is relative dating of artifacts. And relative dating of artifacts is based on the law of superposition, which states that in undisturbed archaeological deposits, the layers closest to the surface are youngest, and those below them are older. So looking at this, if this was the profile of a excavation unit, a hole that we dig in the ground, going from top layer down to the bottom layer, and it was undisturbed. It's important to note the undisturbed, because if it's disturbed and somebody digs it and they throw all that dirt back in with the artifacts and the Paleo-Indian piece ends up on the top, we know it's disturbed. But if it's undisturbed, we know that the Paleo-Indian artifacts on the bottom layer are the oldest. And then the early Archaic, middle Archaic, late Archaic, and the ceramic period. So this is relative dating. based on the law of superposition. The next concept is the concept of cross-dating. So we know that a Paleo-Indian piece, we know what it looks like, and we know what relative time period it comes to based on other things that we may have found with it. If we can do radiocarbon dating or something of that sort, that helps us. We know that the Paleo-Indian piece is older, but do we know how old it is? We have to date it using another dating technique, radiocarbon dating in the most sites. So if there are other sites, say site A, and we see site A and there are diagnostic artifacts that are similar to these middle archaic pieces that we find in our Maine relative dating archaeological excavation unit, then we can say, well, site A, we know that has some middle archaic and it has some ceramic period in it. Site B, we know that has Paleo-Indian and archaic, late archaic period piece in it. We know that site D has Paleo-Indian and middle archaic. So again, this is cross dating, relying on that principle of a diagnostic artifact that is found in one place and we know the relative date on it or a specific date on it. We find that artifact somewhere else. We can tell just by that cross dating technique about what site, what age that site is. Are there any questions on that before I get into shell midden archaeology in particular?
Yes, there's one question generally about this time frame, is about how much do we know about the genetics of the people from these time frames? Do we know, let's see, were the peoples in different periods related, or were they different people, genetically different, or essentially, what do we know about the where the people were coming from and how related they were to each other?
Well, so we know that there was some culture groups that came into Maine, the Susquehanna people, for example. We know that based on not on their genetics, but based on the artifacts that they brought with them. So when we see a change in the cultural toolkit, we can look at that if it's a diagnostic artifact and we say, hey, that looks like, the Susquehanna point that we found down in Pennsylvania. So we get a sense of it that way. Genetic testing, one is that there hasn't been a lot of bone material found, human bone. And two, it's frowned upon to do any kind of genetic testing on anything of that sort. So we don't really know exactly how the natives present in what is now the state of Maine relate to ceramic period people, early ceramic period, middle ceramic period. We don't know how they relate to archaic period people or Paleo-Indian period. And I don't know that we ever will. They're Wabanaki. We know that some of these people were Wabanaki. So there are some cultural ties there, but to go further than that, I think would be difficult to do without really infringing upon the sanctity of human bone. Although it's been done, and I'll discuss that next session, next month, on some burials that were found and that were used, that were tested to look at their diet rather than their genetic sequence.
Great, thanks. And there's a comment, obviously it's interesting because of all the changes and coastline location. There's a question about climate change and the waters of Casco Bay warming. Do you want to take that now, or do you have a specific time about climate change you want to hold that question to?
Well, what's the question?
question is, I've heard that the waters of Casco Bay are warming 99% faster than anywhere else in the world. What is your take on this?
Well, so I've heard that too, but what the reason for that is probably because the water is warming elsewhere. It's warming down in the Gulf of Mexico too, as far as I understand, but because the water in the Gulf of Maine is so cold that, the Gulf Stream goes by it, but because it's so cold that, a 2 degrees warm up might be seen as much more dramatic than something elsewhere. But I'm not, I'm going to touch on environmental reconstruction, but not anything that's so near or happening right now, I guess I should say.
Yeah, that's my understanding too. It has a lot to do with ocean currents.
Yes, yep. Okay, so what exactly is a midden? And what is the origin of the word? One of my favorite subjects is the history of archaeology. And that really brought me into some of the presentations and the couple of articles that I've written for the Maine Archaeological Society Bulletin. And it goes back to 1848 when the Royal Danish Academy of Science established a commission to study the shell middens in Denmark. And the commission was interdisciplinary in nature. They had an archaeologist, a biologist, a geologist, and they published their work in the 1850s. And they called it was a study of the Danish Kjøkkenmyrdings. Kjøkkenmyrdings means kitchen midden. Myrding actually means dung heap. So it's a trash pile. But because they were seeing the dietary remains of the inhabitants, they said, well, this looks like a trash can in the kitchen. So they called it a Kjøkkenmyrding. And Jeffries Wyman, who excavated the Goose Island base site in Casco Bay in the 1860s with Edward Sylvester Morse, picked up on Kjøkkenmyrding for his article on that dig that he wrote in 1868. And he used that in the title, which is where, and this image appeared in that article. And we believe that Wyman's interest in shell midden research and his use of the Danish term stemmed from his reading an English language translation of an 1861 volume, a French volume on archaeology that looked at the Danish shell middens and lake sites in Switzerland. So Kjøkkenmyrding is now down to kitchen midden or just plain midden or shell midden. So pre-European habitation sites on the Maine coast are nearly always indicated by the presence of shell middens. And the importance of shell middens is twofold. The shell in the midden neutralizes the acidity in the surrounding soil. Maine soil, except for up in Aroostook County, potato country, Maine soil is very acidic. And any bone or other perishable material that is buried in Maine soil does not last very long because it's eaten up by that acid. The shell adds an alkaline matter to the soil and helps preserve any non-durable remains discarded along with that shell. That's the first important piece of a shell midden. The second is that the shell increases the visibility of the site. So here we're looking at Broad Cove before we did the dig, before the bathhouse was moved. This is the bathhouse on the right. And you can see right on the bathhouse is built right on top of the midden. We can see the shell there. So the shell helps the visibility of the midden. If you were cruising along the Maine coast and there weren't any shell middens, you wouldn't know where the sites were, where the archaeological sites were, where the pre-European habitation sites were. The midden makes them much more visible. This is the Glidden Midden, part of the Damerscotta Shell Midden Historic District in Damerscotta. Now, this is visible due to its sheer size and the erosion on the bank. This doesn't show erosion. This shows industrial excavation of the shell for the lime it contained. But the midden is visible because of what it holds in it. But it can also be visible because of what grows on it. The changes in the soil acidity helps preserve what's buried with the shells, but it can also change the plant cover that's on the midden. So if you're cruising along the Maine coast and you see a certain vegetation type, and then you see something different, it used to always be goldenrod when we were surveying in Casco Bay in the 1980s. We thought that was an indicator of shell middens. But it's been shown that you can look at the plant cover on a midden and understand that it differs in some way from the plant cover surrounding that midden because of the differing soil types that the vegetation is growing in. So most middens, as we saw the Damerscotta River deposits, very huge. Most middens are not that of that size, that magnitude, that visibility. But their use in deciphering the pre-European history of the region is unquestioned. And that is because of the neutralizing effect of the shell, which preserves food remains, potentially basketry, although, as I said, I've never seen that. Other fragile materials like bone, teeth, nuts, seeds, and any other material that otherwise would have been eaten up by the acidic nature of Maine soil. So all of the things that are not present where a shell midden is not present, that are not preserved because of the acidity, are preserved in a shell midden. So here we're looking at a faunal assemblage from the Broad Cove Reserve Site. We see snails, clamshells, bone and teeth from fish, birds, and mammals, all indicators of the diet that the folk who were camping down there were eating, were targeting, were harvesting from the clam flats down there and hunting and using fish weirs to capture those. So we wouldn't have any of this material if it weren't for the shells being present. So the preserved material in the midden allows us to reconstruct the native diet. Since if we didn't have the shell middens, we wouldn't have any of that, any of these materials. And we know that they're collecting shells, they're eating those shells, and we can surmise that the other things that appear in that kitchen midden, that kitchen trash can, are probably the result of their diet. These are burned hickory nutshells from the Spectacle Island site in Boston Harbor. They're the most calorie-dense wild plant food, and their sweet and fatty nut meat can be used as a raw food. You can break them open and eat it, or you can cook it. You can cook the nut meat in water, and it becomes a fatty porridge. So we find hickory nutshells at a shell midden site. We can say, well, this was part of their diet, okay? And we also know that based on contact period natives that were encountered by the first Europeans that came here, that they were eating this as well. So we have evidence of hickory nutshells being in the diet from archaeological evidence, but also the first contact that these people would have had with the Europeans. So dietary reconstruction can also, it can involve more than just saying, well, they were eating shell, they were eating fish, they were eating birds, they were hunting mammals, etc. This is a chondrophore. That's the hinge on soft shell clam, also known as Maya arenaria. And this is the most common component of a middle to late ceramic period shell midden. The chondrophore is thicker than the rest of the shell. So if the shell gets pulverized or if it gets eroded for any reason, typically the chondrophore is the last thing that we find because of its thickness. So we can collect those chondrophores, we can count them. If we don't want to count each if we don't want to save each chondrophore and count all of the chondrophores that we find on a site, we can do samples of excavation units. We can come up with a raw number of shells found on a site, and from that we can get an estimate of the amount of protein represented by those shells. And remember, protein is a very important part of any human's diet, any mammal's diet. And this gives us an indication of the protein that they were targeting. So animal remains can be used to identify what species were present, but we can also analyze this material deeper. These are cod vertebrae. And we can know exactly what part of the spine this vertebrae was from. There's a part of archaeology, zooarchaeology. It's basically zoology and archaeology combined, where you look at the bones that come from an archaeological site, and you can identify the species, you can identify potentially the size of the individual. You can look at the change in the size of individuals over time, and you can postulate what kind of pressure these animal populations were under. If the size of a cod found in an archaeological site is big on the bottom and much smaller on the top layer of that shell midden, you know that they're targeting smaller and smaller cod, and there's stressors on that cod population. So we talk about environmental reconstruction. We can also reconstruct animal populations over time. These are otoliths, also called ear stones, calcium carbonate structures located directly behind the brain of bony fishes. When we find these in a shell midden, typically cod otoliths, we get excited. Kind of strange, but we can take these otoliths, we can section them, and we can look at the annual and seasonal rings in those otoliths. We can compare them with modern specimens, a study group, and we can determine the season that these cod were dispatched and added to the diet. So it gives us an idea of the seasonality of a site. The seasonality of a site, when that site was being used, lets us know the seasonal rounds, or gives us some indication of the seasonal rounds of the people who were using that site. Again, it's another way to understand how the natives adapted to their environment in pre-European times. So the presence of a species at a site can provide clues to the past environment and environmental changes over time. We're talking about environmental reconstruction. And in the 1860s, when Goose Island was dug, one of the people who was part of that excavation was Reverend Joshua Swan of Kennebunk. And he gave a lecture in 1868, not long after the dig, and he really touched on the piece of environmental reconstruction when he noted the presence of certain rare terrestrial snails at the site in the shell midden. and said, quote, "When a hardwood growth, which is their natural habitat, shaded these slopes, now covered only with the cone-bearing trees." So even almost 150 years ago, there was some indication that they understood that the change in the presence of a species at a certain location could give an indication of the past environment. So shell middens are important insofar as dietary reconstruction of natives, seasonal round reconstruction of those natives, but also of the past environment. And as I said, the past animal population that was present at the time that the site was created. So what we're looking at here is a dog mandible that was found at the base of the shell midden at Broad Cove. So at the most basic level, this tells us that the natives had dogs, whether they were pets or they were used in hunting. We don't know, but we know that dogs were domesticated thousands and thousands of years ago, and that they were present here at Broad Cove between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago, because we found this well-preserved mandible. Now, this doesn't just tell us that there were dogs present. It tells us that. But if we were to do stable isotope analysis on this dog mandible, excuse me, we could infer the diet that this dog was eating. And we know that dogs probably eat the diets of the humans that they cohabited with, whether they scavenged that food or were given that food. It's probable that the food that the natives were eating is the same food that the dog was eating. So stable isotope analysis involves removing the bone protein of this, whatever the sample is, burning it in a mass spectrometer, and then measuring the ratios of carbon and nitrogen. And the different ratios would signify different levels of plant, seafood, or land mammals in the diet. And this has been done on a site in Casco Bay, a shell midden where there was some preserved human bone. And it was found that they were existing on a marine diet. So you find evidence of somebody living around a shell midden, and then you have evidence that yes, they were indeed eating that material. So as Chris mentioned, in the summer of 1992, I worked on the Big Dig on Spectacle Island, part of the Big Dig. It was Spectacle Island. Anybody, if you don't know what Spectacle Island now, it's a public park. You can go out there. You can take a harbor cruise out to Spectacle Island. They have a 5K on the island during the spring, I think it is. But it used to be a site habitated by farmers in the early European period. There was a quarantine hospital out there, animal rendering plant, a glue factory, resort hotels, and it ended its first life as a garbage dump. But it was to undergo dramatic change due to spoil dumping and transformation into that public park as part of the Big Dig. When they dug the third harbor tunnel, most of the earth excavated came out to Spectacle Island, capped the island, and turned it into the public park it is today. Before they did that, because it got federal money, they had to do a field survey and shovel test pitting, archaeological survey to make sure that they weren't destroying any significant cultural resources, and they found a site on the eastern side of the island. Now, what I want to do here is just talk about what we do in the field when we're going to dig a site. And I chose Spectacle Island because it's near and dear to my heart, shall we say. So what we did when we went out there, we knew that there were some indications of cultural resources out there, but we still had to find where the biggest concentrations of them were. So initially we dug at the bottom part of this little map, this little graphic you have here. We dug these diagonal lines of 5 1 square meter excavation units to try and locate the biggest concentrations of material. And once we've located that concentration, we expanded the digging part to maximize the extraction of the cultural materials there. Now, we did the same thing at Broad Cove, but in a much smaller scale, of course. It was a much smaller site, but it was also because our research design had that diagonal grid piece in it, but our end plan was much different. At Spectacle Island, we knew that the site was going to be capped by all of the spoil from the Ted Williams Tunnel, and that we would never have a chance to dig at that site again. So we tried to dig as much of that site as possible, pull everything off so we could analyze it and contribute to the archaeological record. At Broad Cove Reserve, we decided we weren't going to dig the whole site. We dug about 40% of it. And the reason being is we wanted to leave part of that for future archaeologists who may have better tools to study archaeological sites and better concepts for analyzing archaeological sites. So the initial placement of the excavation units were similar, but the end plan was different, and therefore different outcomes for the site itself. Broad Cove Reserve site is capped, but it could be dug back up. We could scrape off the topsoil that we put on, and we could go back and dig again there if we wanted to. It looks like I've gone over. I have some pictures from Spectacle Island if people want to see those, or do I have a lot of questions that anybody would like to ask at this point? I can just do a quick run through of some artifacts, or we can go right to the questions. Up to you, Chris.
We just have one question right now, and it was around those honeycomb looking things when you first showed an image of what was found at Broad Cove. Somebody's asking what that material was. So maybe if you want to answer that and show some photos, because and that might trigger some more questions from people.
Okay, the honeycomb things, and I will show more of those in a month, but those are sturgeon scutes. So sturgeon, you can find sturgeon. We found sturgeon, evidence of sturgeon that were 12 feet long at Broad Cove. The scute is kind of like an armor plating on the sturgeon. Very prevalent in shell middens of the age that we think that Broad Cove Reserve is, and we found them out on Mosier Island, we found them on Chebeague Island, but they're a good indication of an inshore fishery where these sturgeons were coming inshore. They were being targeted maybe with, if they were that big, I'm thinking they were using some kind of bone harpoon to get them, but they would have been a pretty good haul if you have a 12-foot fish. So that's what those honeycomb things were. We want to do just a quick run through of the Spectacle Island dig, so you can get some of the sense of the romanticism of doing island archaeology.
Yeah, that sounds good. And the other question is around where have you dug on Chebeague, or where have there been digs? I know you may touch on that more in your next.
I will. So
webinar,
just to give you a hint of what we're going to, there have been found at least 24 shell middens out on Chebeague Island. There are only 2 professional reports written. So most of the shell middens were just surveyed. We found the shell midden, but nobody has gone back there and dug them. So potentially we could end up doing that this summer or in the future, depending on what, where those shell middens are. If the landowner was willing to do something of that sort, I think it'd be very exciting, but most of the shell middens on Chebeague have not been dug. But as we said, I'm going to touch on one of them that gives us a good indication of what was going on out there next time. So let me just do a quick run through just to give you an idea of why I get so excited about island archaeology. So this is the bus stop. We took off from the Charlestown Naval Yard every morning on 2 sea tow boats. This is my crew here. Here we are cruising out, luckily against the traffic. Boston rush hour, as you know, can be kind of difficult. The ferries would be coming in while we were going out to Spectacle Island. And there were mornings when it was so foggy that we almost had encounters, close encounters with those ferries. Here we are on the beach on Spectacle Island. Now, as I mentioned, Spectacle Island was a garbage dump. We surface collected so many bottles from the 17th and 18th century. It was incredible out there. But this is something, this is a picture that tells you something about the nature of cultural resource management archaeology. And that term, CRM, if there is a big development project that has any kind of federal funding or is seen to be potentially disrupting significant cultural resources, you have to do an assessment, an archaeological assessment. And they did that at Spectacle Island, and then they brought us out to do a much more in-depth one. But this shows, you know, the counterpoint between the development in the background, those big earth-moving machines, and the archaeologists in the front hoping to get out as much archaeological significant material as possible before it's destroyed or buried by these earth-moving machines. Here's just a picture of the excavation units with that diagonal grid. Here we are working on the site. You can see that, you know, you have piles of the debris in the back on the right there, people digging, hauling those buckets to the screens, screening them. And some of the things that we found, it was a middle to late ceramic period, or down there we call it woodland period, but here just a couple of pieces of ceramics. Groundstone pendant with a hole in it, so potentially something that was worn as ornament. Here's a Lancelot biface on the left and a small stem point made out of purple felsite on the right, so a couple of stone tool artifacts. A couple more here, notched point, Neville point. Again, these are all diagnostic artifacts that help us date the site. Meadow wood point with the side notches down at the bottom to haft it to a shaft as a bow and arrow. A grinding stone, a pestle for grinding corn. We don't know. Down there would have been that Three Sister horticulture much earlier than up here in Maine. So potentially middle to late woodland, they would have had some horticulture and they would have been able to incorporate that into their diet. This slide is of 3 bird bones. This is my duck, duck, goose slide. We've identified these as a duck, and a goose. So we know that they were targeting different species of avian creatures. These are beautiful worked deer bone harpoons. If we think that they're targeting seals and swordfish in particular, if they're going out and getting swordfish in the open ocean with worked deer bone harpoon, it sounds like a pretty dangerous occupation to me, but hopefully we know that these things worked and that they're able to target those swordfish. And just 2 slides of worked bone, probably bone points that were used in targeting animals for eating. So, as I said, this was a lot of information. We went a little longer over than I thought, but as we said at the beginning, next month, we're going to be doing some site-specific discussing 3 or 4 sites in Casco Bay, looking at the similarities between those sites, the differences between those sites, and what those sites can tell us about native lifeways over the past, most of them are probably 2,000 years old.
Thank you, Thomas. And
Thank
Chris.
you.
Yeah,
was
no, thank
fantastic.
you.
This was
Wonderful.
fantastic and very informative. Thank you. I just want to clarify something that you mentioned, Thomas, that you would like to explore the possibility of doing this live next time. I just want to assure people that if you signed up with the expectation that this would be virtual, if we did do it live, and that decision has not been made at this point, we would do it as a hybrid event. So you could still participate virtually if you if that's what you're able to do, or if that's what you would prefer to do. So I just wanted to make that clear, that you would still, we're not going to leave you behind. Don't worry. So.
And just if I may add again, just going beyond next month's presentation, we do want to do some field work. So I think there are some people from Chebeague Island in the crowd. If you know of shell middens out there that you would like us to come and take a look at, what we want to do is we really want to document the shell middens as they are now before they're washed away. And I'm not saying that everything's going to be washed away, but we know that sea level rise is occurring. We know that it's eroding the islands in Casco Bay, the coastline in Casco Bay, the mainland. And we want to make sure that these shell middens, if they can't be preserved, that we can at least preserve their memory and what they can offer us insofar as information about the culture of the natives who inhabited this region before we did.
Great. And I see Donna Damon is offering to show you many of them, Thomas.
Oh, thank you, Donna. I appreciate that.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. This was an excellent presentation, and we look forward to seeing you all next month, April 7th at 6:30 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone in the audience.
Thanks,
Good night.
everyone.